This is my true story. I worked the fields for decades, building a farm worth $2.1 million with my bare hands. Every sunrise, I labored so my family would eat, so they would have a future stronger than mine. I thought my children would honor that sacrifice. But one day, they sold my farm behind my back and left me with nothing. I was crushed, broken, and betrayed. What they didn't know was the land was still in my name. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. And please subscribe. My life was carved into the soil. From the time I was a young man until my hair turned white, my hands carried the weight of the land. I rose every morning before the sun, when the sky was still dark and the air was cold, and I walked out into the fields. The earth was not soft. It was hard, stubborn, and unkind. But I worked it until it listened. With my shovel, with my plow, with my sweat, I turned empty land into a farm that fed my family. Day after day, year after year, I gave everything I had to that soil. The farm was not just land to me. It was my blood, my back, my sacrifice. I planted seed after seed, sometimes in hope, sometimes in fear, because farming is never certain. There were years when rain drowned the crops, years when the sun burned them to dust, years when storms tore through the fields and left me with nothing. But even in those years, I refused to give up. I went back out, bent my spine again, and planted again, because I knew my family depended on it. When my children were small, they would stand at the edge of the field and watch me work. They saw me bent over with sweat dripping from my forehead. But I smiled at them anyway. I wanted them to know that their father would never let them go hungry. I wanted them to believe that no matter how hard life became, they would always have food on the table because of me. And I kept that promise. I missed meals so they could eat. I sold my own belongings so they could have books and shoes. Slowly the farm grew. One piece of land turned into two, then into more. With every harvest, I saved a little. With every year, I added more to the farm. I built barns to store the grain. I bought better tools. I fixed fences with my own hands. And when the years were kinder, when the earth gave me plenty, I sold the extra and saved the money. Little by little, through decades of struggle, I built a fortune without ever calling it that. To me, it was not money. It was security. It was a shield for my family, a future for them when I was gone. The value of the farm grew until one day it was worth $2.1 million, a number so large I could hardly believe it myself. I never thought of myself as rich. I was just a farmer. But the land that once looked worthless had become treasure, and I thought, this is my gift to them. Not gold, not jewels, not luxury, but land that could always give food, always give income, always give stability. I believed with all my heart that my children would protect it. I believed they would respect what I had built with sweat and pain. I believed they would look at the fields and see not just crops, but their father's life written in the soil. I imagined them taking care of me in my old age, keeping the farm alive and passing it down with pride. I never asked them for riches. I never asked them for anything but care. I thought in my last years, I would sit on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sunset fall over the same fields I once plowed, with my family beside me. I thought my reward for a lifetime of sacrifice would be love, respect, and peace. That was my dream. That was my belief. That was the reason I never gave up, no matter how hard the work was. Every broken bone, every cut hand, every sleepless night. I told myself it would all be worth it because my family would never forget. But I was wrong. The change in my family did not happen in one day. It came slowly, like a shadow creeping across the fields I once worked. At first, it was in their eyes. When they looked at the farm, they no longer saw home. They no longer saw sacrifice. They no longer saw the years of labor that had built it. They saw numbers. They saw money. They saw what the land could give them, not what it had already given. Conversations at the dinner table began to shift. Once, we talked about harvests, about the weather, about the stories of my youth when I fought against storms and droughts. Now, their voices turned to questions of value. How much could this field sell for? What do you think the barns are worth? If we sold this land, how much money would it bring? They spoke as if the farm was already theirs, as if I were gone. Respect faded slowly too. They stopped asking for my opinion. They stopped listening when I spoke. When I reminded them how hard it had been to build the farm, they waved their hands and said times were different now. When I tried to teach them the old ways, they laughed and called them useless. They forgot that those useless ways had built everything they were now enjoying. Their words began to sting. They started calling me old, slow, a burden. They spoke about me as though I was in the way, as though the farm would thrive better without me around. They looked at me not as the man who gave them everything, but as a weight holding them back from taking more. Each word felt like a cut, small at first, but together they bled me dry. I saw greed in their actions too. They stopped helping me in the fields. They stopped caring about the land itself. They cared only about what it was worth. They let fences rot. They ignored repairs. They left tools rusting in the barn. When I asked them why, they shrugged and said it didn't matter. Someday soon, it would all be sold anyway. The house began to feel colder, not because of the weather, but because of the way they looked at me. They no longer smiled when I walked into the room. They no longer sat with me to share stories. They whispered behind closed doors, and when I entered, they grew quiet. I knew what they were talking about. They were planning. They were calculating. They were already dividing a fortune they did not yet own. It broke me to see it. I remembered the days when they were children, running through the fields with laughter, their hands grabbing mine as they begged me to carry them on my shoulders. I remembered feeding them when there was barely enough for me. I remembered working until my back ached so they could go to school, so they would never feel hunger. I thought those memories would live in their hearts forever. But greed erased them. The signs were clear. My children no longer saw me as a father. They saw me as an obstacle. They no longer saw the farm as a legacy. They saw it as money waiting to be taken. And though I tried to deny it, deep inside, I knew what was coming. The day of betrayal came without warning, yet deep in my heart, I had felt it approaching. It was like watching storm clouds gather above a field. You don't know the hour the rain will fall, but you know it will. I woke that morning like any other, my bones aching from age, but my mind still tied to the land. I stepped outside, breathing in the familiar scent of soil and grass, the air that had carried me through decades of labor. I thought it was an ordinary day. I was wrong. By afternoon, whispers turned into open words. My children gathered, their faces hard, their voices sharp. They told me the farm was no longer mine to worry about. They told me that decisions had been made, that the land was gone. I did not understand at first. How could the land be gone when I had not agreed to sell it? How could the soil I had poured my blood into, the barns I had built with my own 2 hands, be taken without me? Then the truth struck me. They had sold it. Without my knowledge, without my blessing, without my signature, they had put my farm into the hands of strangers. They spoke coldly, their words like ice. "It's our turn now. You've had enough." That was what they said. Those words cut deeper than any wound my body had ever endured. I stood there, unable to breathe. My chest felt hollow, my heart crushed. I looked at their faces, searching for a hint of regret, a flicker of love. But there was none. Only greed, only pride, only the satisfaction of taking what they believed was already theirs. In that moment, I felt stripped of everything. No house, no money, no dignity. They had taken the farm, the land, the barns, the fields, the very core of my life, and sold it as if it were nothing but numbers on paper. I had spent decades working under the sun, freezing in the winter winds, bleeding from my hands, breaking my back. I had endured hunger so they could eat. And now, they had turned all of it into cash, leaving me with nothing. I walked the fields that evening, though they were no longer mine. Strangers were already there, looking over what they thought they had purchased, walking across the soil that once carried my footprints alone. I stood at a distance, my body heavy, my spirit broken. The farm I had dreamed of passing down was gone, stolen not by thieves in the night, but by the very family I had built it for. That was betrayal. Not just the loss of land, but the loss of trust. Not just the theft of property, but the theft of love. My children, my blood, had looked at me not as their father, but as an obstacle standing in the way of their greed. They had erased me with a single act, casting me aside as if I were nothing but a shadow. And yet, in their arrogance, in their blindness, they had forgotten one truth, a truth they would soon regret. After the betrayal, I sat alone in silence. The house no longer felt like mine. The land outside no longer answered to me. My heart, which once beat with pride every time I looked at those fields, now felt empty. I would wake at dawn out of habit, ready to walk the rows of crops, ready to check the barns, ready to feed the animals. But when I stepped outside, strangers were there. They walked my soil, they examined my barns, they pointed at my fences as if they were inspecting property they had bought. I stood there quietly, watching them move through the life I had built, and each step they took cut me deeper. I tried to sit on the porch where I once drank my coffee and listened to the birds, but it no longer felt the same. I watched people I had never met walking across the land I once protected with my body. My family, the ones I had given everything for, were inside, speaking of money, planning what they would do with the cash they thought they had gained. They laughed, they dreamed, they spoke of futures filled with comfort. And I sat outside, alone, invisible, as though I had never existed. Every sight, every sound reminded me of sacrifice. The plow sitting by the barn reminded me of nights I stayed out late turning soil in the moonlight. The cracked boots by the door reminded me of winters when I walked miles through snow just to make sure animals had feed. The calluses on my hands reminded me of years of pain, years of endurance, years of love poured into every acre. And now, all of it was gone, not lost to storm or fire, but stolen by my own blood. I remembered each dawn when I carried seed in a sack on my back, planting one row at a time while my children slept warmly in their beds. I remembered rushing to cover crops during sudden frost, my hands numb, my breath heavy while they laughed by the fire I had built. I remembered eating stale bread and drinking cold water because I wanted them to have fresh food instead. And as I remembered, I realized something painful. None of it had mattered to them. None of it lived in their hearts. They saw only money. The days after the betrayal stretched like an endless winter. I ate little, spoke little, and slept little. I felt like a ghost wandering through the shell of my own life. Sometimes I walked to the edge of the field and stood there, staring at the horizon where I once dreamed of my family's future. Tears would come, hot against the cold air, and I would wipe them quickly, ashamed of my weakness. But inside, I was not weak. I was broken. I asked myself again and again, how could they do this? How could the same children who once ran through these fields laughing, who once held my hand while I taught them how to plant seeds, who once looked up to me with trust, now turn so cruel? How could love rot into greed so completely? I had no answer, only silence. The worst pain was not the loss of land. It was the loss of belonging. I felt like I no longer had a place in the world. I had worked my whole life to build something lasting, and now I was left with nothing but memories. My family treated me as if I were already gone, as if I were just an old man waiting to die. They took my farm, they took my dignity, and they left me with silence. But even as I sat there, drowning in despair, something inside me whispered. A faint thought, weak but steady, reminding me of one truth they had forgotten. The land, no matter what they claimed, no matter what papers they showed to strangers, was still in my name. The deeds, the titles, the ownership, it was all tied to me. They had forgotten that. They had moved too quickly, too arrogantly, and in their greed, they had overlooked the most important fact. At that time, I did not yet act. I only suffered in silence, carrying the weight of betrayal. But that small whisper in my mind was the spark of something more. It told me my story was not yet over. As I sat in silence, watching strangers walk across the soil of my life, one thought kept returning to me like a steady drumbeat. The land was still mine. They could laugh, they could spend, they could brag, but none of their words could change the truth written on paper. Every deed, every title, every legal document carried one name, and it was not theirs. It was mine. My children had rushed into greed so quickly that they forgot the most important detail of all. They had tried to sell what they did not own. I remembered the day I signed those documents years ago. I had sat in a small office, my hands rough from work, gripping the pen tightly as I wrote my name. The lawyer had looked at me and said, "Keep it in your name until the very end. That way, no one can cheat you." At the time, I smiled and thought it was only a safeguard. I trusted my family. I never imagined they would betray me. But now, those words came back with power. That single choice, that one decision to keep the land in my name, had become my shield. As my family celebrated what they believed was theirs, I sat quietly, holding on to the truth. I did not speak of it. I did not remind them. I let them believe they had won. I listened as they spoke of spending money that did not exist, of buying cars, of building new houses, of living lives they thought the farm had already given them. Their greed blinded them so deeply that they did not even think to check the documents. They only thought of the gold in their hands, not realizing it was dust. I watched the buyers too. Strangers walked the land, confident in their purchase, thinking they had secured something valuable. They did not know the ground beneath their feet was still tied to me. They did not know the barns they admired, the fields they measured, the fences they inspected. All of it was still mine in the eyes of the law. I said nothing. I simply watched. Because silence was my weapon now. Inside, my despair began to shift. The pain of betrayal was still heavy, but it was no longer crushing me. It was shaping me. It was pushing me to see that I was not powerless. My family thought they had stripped me of everything, but in truth, they had nothing. They had betrayed me, yes, but they had also betrayed themselves. They had tried to steal what they could never own. The more I thought of it, the calmer I became. Their betrayal was deep, but my power was deeper. Their greed was loud, but the truth was louder. The farm was still mine. The land was still mine. The inheritance they thought they had stolen was still in my hands. And when the time came, I would show them. The forgotten truth was simple. They had abandoned their father, but they could not erase his name. They could not change the ink on the papers. They could not take what was never theirs. And when the moment came, the land itself would rise against their lies. The day came when silence was no longer enough. For weeks I had sat in the shadows, watching my family celebrate money they did not truly have. Watching strangers measure my fields and speak as if they owned them. My heart was broken, but my mind was steady. I knew the truth, and I knew it was time to act. That morning, I rose from my chair, put on my old coat, and walked toward the courthouse with a resolve I had not felt in years. My legs were weak, my steps slow, but each one carried the weight of justice. I did not go alone. I visited my lawyer first. He greeted me with a look of sorrow when I told him what my family had done, but when I laid the deeds on his desk, his sorrow turned to strength. "They forgot," he said quietly. "They thought it was theirs, but it never was." He gathered the documents, checked every page, every signature, every seal, and nodded. Everything was still in my name. The land, the barns, the fields, the entire $2.1 million farm. Legally, it was still mine. We walked into the courthouse together. The halls were cold, but I felt a strange warmth inside me. This was not the warmth of fire or food, but the warmth of knowing I was about to reclaim what was stolen. We presented the original land titles, the deeds with my name, the proof of ownership no one could deny. The officials looked at the papers, compared them with the fraudulent documents my family had used to sell the farm, and the truth was undeniable. The sale was invalid. In a single stroke, with one decision, their betrayal crumbled. The buyers who thought they had purchased my land were left with nothing but anger and broken promises. Their contracts were worthless because the man who owned the land had never agreed to sell it. My children, who had laughed at me, who had told me it was their turn now, were suddenly exposed as liars and frauds. I stood there quietly, my hands trembling not from weakness, but from release. The weight I had carried since the betrayal began to lift. For the first time, I looked at the papers not as numbers, not as property, but as justice. My name, written years ago with rough hands, had saved me. My decision to hold on to ownership until the very end had become my shield. When the ruling was announced, I did not cheer. I did not shout. I simply lowered my head and let the silence speak for me. They had tried to erase me, but I had risen again. They had tried to steal my life's work, but the law had handed it back to me. That was my awakening. The moment I realized that even in betrayal, even in despair, I still had power. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten the strength of a farmer who had built everything from nothing. They had forgotten the value of a name written in ink, and I had reminded them. When the truth came out in the courthouse, the walls of my family's pride began to crumble. The buyers who thought they had secured my farm stormed into the halls with anger burning in their voices. They pointed at my children, shouting words filled with rage, accusing them of fraud, of deceit, of lies. Contracts that were once celebrated as deals of fortune now lay torn and worthless. My children's faces turned pale, their hands shook, and for the first time I saw fear in the eyes that once looked at me with arrogance. The officials declared the sale invalid. Every paper signed without my consent was nothing but a useless stack of lies. The buyers, furious at being cheated, demanded their money back. Lawsuits were filed. Letters of demand piled up. What my family thought would be a future of wealth turned overnight into a storm of debt and humiliation. The same voices that once laughed about how they had outgrown me now trembled under the weight of public shame. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who once nodded at my children now looked at them with disgust. Relatives whispered in hushed tones, asking how greed could blind them so deeply. The story was repeated again and again. They had betrayed their own father, tried to steal what was not theirs, and ended up destroying themselves. Wherever they went, eyes followed them, not with respect, but with judgment. Inside the house, their pride collapsed into chaos. Arguments filled the rooms. They blamed each other for the failure, for not checking the deeds, for not realizing the land was still in my name. They shouted until their voices cracked, and I sat silently in the corner, listening. I did not need to add my words to their noise. Their downfall spoke louder than I ever could. Debts grew heavier. The buyers who had been deceived threatened legal action that would cost more than they had ever imagined. The money they had dreamed of spending turned into bills they could not pay. One by one, their plans fell apart. The new cars they spoke of buying never came. The new houses they boasted about building remained only in their dreams. Their future, once painted with gold in their greedy eyes, was now nothing but ashes. And still, they looked at me, hoping for mercy, hoping I would somehow rescue them from the fire they had set themselves. But I remained quiet. I had given them everything already: my life, my labor, my love. They had chosen betrayal, and now they were living inside the ruin of their own choices. The fallout was not only financial, it was personal. Their reputation, their pride, their place in the community was gone. They were marked by disgrace, and no matter how many excuses they tried to make, no one believed them anymore. The truth was written in the soil, in the law, and in the scars they had left on me. That was the fallout. Their greed had destroyed them, and my silence had protected me. After the courthouse, life inside the house changed completely. The same children who once spoke with arrogance now walked with lowered heads. The laughter that used to fill the rooms was gone, replaced with whispers, arguments, and long silences. They no longer bragged about money, no longer spoke about new cars or new houses. Instead, they sat at the table with papers in front of them, letters of debt, notices of lawsuits, demands from angry buyers who wanted their money back. Every time the door knocked, they flinched, afraid of what news would come next. They turned to me then, the same man they had betrayed, the same father they had pushed aside. Their voices grew soft, their words careful, almost begging. They asked me for forgiveness. They asked me to help them. They asked me to fix the disaster they had created. But when I looked into their eyes, I saw not love, not regret, but fear. They were not sorry for what they had done to me. They were sorry because they had been caught. They were sorry because their greed had turned against them. I listened quietly, but I did not answer. My silence was heavier than any words I could have spoken. I thought back to the nights I worked in the freezing fields, to the mornings I rose before the sun, to the sacrifices I made when I went hungry so they would eat. I thought of the day they sold my farm behind my back, the day they told me coldly, "It's our turn now." And I knew then that forgiveness would never bring back the respect they had stolen from me. The community turned its back on them too. Neighbors who once greeted them now avoided their eyes. Relatives who once praised them now shook their heads in shame. They had not only betrayed me, they had betrayed the family name. And in doing so, they had destroyed the very thing they thought they were securing, their future. As for me, I felt a strange calm. For the first time in many years, I no longer feared their power over me. They had shown their true faces, and I had survived it. They had tried to take everything, and yet I still had control. My name was still on the deeds, my hand had reclaimed the farm, and my dignity was no longer theirs to break. The aftermath was simple. They were left with shame, and I was left with clarity. They had begged for forgiveness, but I had no forgiveness left to give. Some wounds cannot be healed with words, and betrayal by blood is one of them. When the dust settled and their cries for forgiveness faded into silence, I made my choice. I had seen enough. I had endured enough. I had suffered enough. My family had shown me what I meant to them. Nothing but an obstacle, nothing but a shadow they wanted gone. They had sold my farm behind my back, laughed at my pain, and only turned soft when their greed collapsed into shame. I knew then that I could not spend the rest of my life sitting in the same house with the same faces, pretending that everything could be repaired. It could not. So I reclaimed the farm in my name. I stood in the fields once more, the sun falling across the soil that had carried my sweat for decades, and I felt both sadness and strength. Sadness because the dream of passing it down to my family was dead. Strength because it was mine again. Not theirs, not the buyers, not anyone else's. Mine. I walked the barns, touched the fences, ran my hands over the wooden beams I had built, and I knew what I had to do. I sold it. But this time, it was on my terms, not theirs, not in secrecy, not in betrayal. I walked back into the courthouse with my lawyer, signed the papers myself, and transferred the land legally to buyers who respected me, who looked me in the eyes, who shook my hand with dignity. When the sale was done, the money, all $2.1 million, went directly into my account. Safe, secure, untouched by the greedy hands that once tried to steal it. I did not tell my family. I did not share a word. I packed a small bag, just enough for the journey ahead. Clothes, a few photographs, and the documents that proved what I had done. I left the rest behind. No goodbyes, no explanations, no warnings. I simply walked out the door, the same door they once slammed in my face, and this time I never turned back. I bought a one-way ticket to a place far from them, far from the fields, far from the shadows of betrayal. A quiet place, where no one knew my name, where no one saw me as a fortune to claim. As the train pulled away, I looked out the window and felt the weight lift from my chest. I was not leaving as a broken man. I was leaving as a man who had taken back his dignity, who had written his justice into the world with silence and resolve. Back at the house, they discovered the truth too late. They found the land empty, the farm no longer theirs to dream about, the money gone. They searched for me, but I was already gone, vanished from their reach. All they had left was their shame, their debts, and the memory of what they had done to the man who gave them everything. That was my disappearance. Quiet, final, complete. In the end, justice did not come with noise. It came in silence, in choices made carefully, in papers signed with a steady hand. My family thought they had stolen everything from me when they sold the farm behind my back. They thought they had left me with nothing, just an old man waiting for his last days. But they were wrong. The land was still in my name, the power was still mine, and when I acted, their greed turned into their ruin. Now I live in peace. I eat meals at my own table, meals I paid for with the money they thought would be theirs. Each bite reminds me that dignity tastes better than any riches. I sleep in a quiet room, and when I close my eyes, I do not see their faces anymore. I see freedom. I see the sun rising over fields far away from them. I see myself not as a victim, but as a man who endured betrayal and still stood tall. My family lives with shame now. They walk under the weight of what they did, and the community has not forgotten. People whisper about them, not with respect, but with disgust. Their names, once carried with pride, are now marks of greed. They thought the farm would be their future, but in the end, it became their curse. They lost everything, not because of storms or droughts, but because of their own hands. And me? I am no longer tied to their betrayal. I do not sit waiting for their forgiveness. I do not long for their love. They made their choice, and I made mine. They sold my farm behind my back, so I sold their future in plain sight. That was my justice. I do not hate them. I do not wish them harm. But I will never forget what they did. And I will never return. Because true justice is not giving them another chance. True justice is living the rest of my life in dignity, knowing they cannot touch me again. So I live quietly now, with respect from strangers and peace in my heart. My final thought is this. They sold my farm behind my back. I sold their future in plain sight.